Hi everybody, and welcome to tonight's video where we are going to be talking about classifying triangles. So in this chapter we're going to talk a lot about triangles and proving triangles are congruent and some different theorems and postulates. But first of all, we want to just talk about triangles and a couple of different ways that we have to classify them. So when we're talking about important parts of triangles, the two parts that we think of the most are the angles and the sides. So we're going to have two ways to classify these triangles, one using their angles and one using their sides. So first let's talk about classifying triangles by the angles. So first of all triangles have three angles by definition, and two of those angles are always going to be acute. That's just the way that it works if you're going to make a shape of a triangle. Two of the angles are always acute. So basically we were looking at the third angle to help us classify it. And the third angle can be one of three different types. It can be acute, where it's less than 90 degrees. It can be a right angle, where it's equal to 90 degrees. Or it can be obtuse, which is greater than 90. And so those are also the names that we use to classify the triangle. So a triangle can be acute, right, or obtuse. It'll be acute if all three angles are less than 90. It'll be right if there is one angle that is equal to 90, and it'll be obtuse if there is one angle that is greater than 90. So if we look at a set of triangles here, we have an example of one that is acute, one that is right, and one that is obtuse. So if we want to look at these, we'll notice that with this triangle here, all three of these angles are acute, which means they are less than 90. Now, it doesn't matter. Maybe a couple of them here look like they might be congruent. That's okay. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for now, just look at all three angles and check if all three are acute, then the triangle itself would be an acute triangle. Here, since I see a right angle, I am going to classify this triangle as a right triangle. So the triangle itself is called a right triangle because we see that right angle. And remember, we're always looking for that symbol of a box in the corner, basically, to make a right angle. And here, we have an obtuse angle, right? We have an angle that is greater than 90 degrees. So that makes that an obtuse angle, and therefore it's an obtuse triangle. So those are examples of three different types of triangles that one is acute, one is right, and one is obtuse. Now we would use our protractor to measure all of these angles and check to make sure, but generally speaking, we are going to be able to classify these triangles just by sight, based off of whether or not the angles are all three acute, one right, and one obtuse. Okay, so that's how to classify these angles, or these triangles by their angles. The other way, like we said, is by their sides. So all triangles have three sides, just like they have three angles. So we're going to classify these triangles based on how many of those sides are congruent to each other. And so we can have three different scenarios, just like we had three different types when we classified by angles. We'll have three different types when we classify by sides. So it could be the case where none of the sides are congruent, right? So if none of them are congruent, that's what's called a scalene triangle, okay? If two of these sides are congruent, then that's called an isosceles triangle. And we're going to want to make sure that we're always paying attention to our spelling here. These are some new words possibly, so scalene and isosceles. Going to have to get the hang of spelling that. And then there could be the case where all three of the sides are congruent, and that's a special type of triangle called an equilateral triangle. We'll explain a little bit more about that one, why it's special in a second. But here are your three different scenarios. Scalene, none of the sides are congruent. Isosceles, two of them are congruent. And equilateral, where all three of them are congruent. And the way that we're going to know if these sides are congruent is we're going to look for those little congruent symbols. And remember, when we're drawing a shape, to show that two sides or segments are congruent, we're going to have a little hash mark on it. Also keep in mind here that classification by side does not necessarily depend on the angle classification. So we're going to see, maybe some triangles that will fit in only one angle classification, but we'll see a couple examples where they would fit in two different ones. So like we have down here, it looks like both of these triangles here are right triangles, right? So this one, if that's a right angle right there, but I have one that's scalene and one that's isosceles. So don't necessarily think that the angle classification and side classification are related. It's really, they're two separate things. So in this case, this is what we would call a scalene triangle because all three of these sides are of different lengths. So none of the sides are congruent. And I can also notice that there's no congruent symbols here. Over here, this is an isosceles triangle because I see two of the three sides are marked as being congruent, right? So this side here and this side here. And then over here, this is what's called an equilateral triangle, and that's because all three sides are marked to be congruent, okay? So scalene triangles are not necessarily always going to be right triangles, right? They could look differently, and isosceles aren't always going to be right triangles. So like I said, don't worry about the angle classification in relation to the sides necessarily. Really what you're looking for in all of these is the congruent symbol to check either none, two, or all three, okay, to fall under scalene, isosceles, and equilateral. And so when we're looking at triangles, we classify them both, right? So this would be a scalene right triangle. This would be an isosceles right triangle. This would be an equilateral acute triangle, right? Because I don't see any angles here that are greater than 90. But like I mentioned a few minutes ago, or a few seconds ago rather, the equilateral triangle is a special type of triangle because it is also equilateral and equiangular, right? Which means all three sides are congruent and all three angles are congruent as well. They're going to be 60 degrees. And we'll talk more about angle measures of triangles a little bit later. But I just wanted to show you that an equilateral triangle is also equiangular, which means all the sides are the same and all the angles are the same as well. So what we're going to do with these is you're going to get in the habit of identifying different triangles and classifying them based off of their sides, scalene, isosceles, or equilateral, and their angles, so acute, right, or obtuse. And then we're going to use some facts with these equilateral and equiangular triangles and also isosceles triangles. We'll do some algebra where, I'll give you the measure of this side in terms of x and the measure of this side in terms of x, and you'll set them equal to each other, so on and so forth. But we'll do examples like that in class tomorrow. So basically, make sure you got everything written down here. Nice pictures of these three different examples. Make sure you have that in your notes for tomorrow. Make sure you're clear on what these different classifications are and why they have these different names, which ones match up with which. And we'll do some practice problems in class tomorrow. So make sure you write down any questions you have, and I will see you then. Have a great night.